Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is kind of an unusual Wednesday evening or afternoon. I know you're probably watching this some other time, but welcome to this great evening of conversation here. We have a very special guest, Sheldon Solomon, PhD, experimental social psychologist. He teaches at Skidmore College in New York. I'm a big fan because his book, Greenberg and Pazinski, Becker, a bunch of other guys, but these guys are the main players in my mind when it comes to understanding this idea of fear of the psychological death of not existing, terror management theory these guys came up with many, many years ago. And we wanted to bring Sheldon on and have him talk a little bit about this intersection of art, creativity, and mortality. And do artists struggle any differently or similarly as the regular folks? So, Sheldon, thank you. Thank you. We're happy to have you, and welcome to this little piece of the internet.
Well, thank you, Quinn and Jeffrey, for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know what we'd like to do, maybe, Sheldon, is can we start off with you're probably over this. Like I always think about these rock stars playing the Stones up there playing, Beast of Burden or something for the millionth time. And it's like, God, are they really into this, or are they going to get through this? So, but if you'd give us the Becker TMT overview, I'm going to mute myself and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Quinn. I'm always amazed when I see the people in theater or musicians doing something that they've probably done hundreds of times as if it's never been performed before. I try to do the same thing by reminding myself as I talk about these ideas that they are as pertinent to me as they are to everybody around me. It's tempting sometimes to think that we have this kind of privileged position as a cognitive overlord, looking at things from a somewhat detached perspective, as if we're not subject to them. Be that as it may, the work that I do with my buddies Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski is based on cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, who died, I think, in 1973 or 4, 6 weeks after he published the Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Denial of Death. And we stumbled on Becker's work by accident. In 1980, it was my first week as a professor at Skidmore. I was in the library looking for a Freud book, and Becker's books, they just got my attention. One of them was called The Birth and Death of Meaning. And in the first paragraph, he said, I want to figure out why people do what they do when they do it. And I was like, dude, me too. I just love that he just cut through the academic fog and said, let's take an interdisciplinary look at what it is that underlies the human behavior. All right, then right next to that book was his book, The Denial of Death, where he says in the first paragraph that it is the uniquely human awareness of death and our disinclination to accept the reality of the human condition that is the primary motivational impetus for almost everything that people do, whether we're aware of it or not. And that just kicked me in the psychological groin, because when I saw that, I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is much more than an academic idea to talk to students about so we can have a multiple choice question on an exam. I was like, wait, he's talking about me. I remember the day when I was 8 years old and realized that I was going to die, and the existential effects of that that have persisted throughout my life. And so anyway, back to Becker, let's just do a 5-minute classic comic book overview, because he's like, all right, Let's lay it out very simply. He starts with Darwin. He says people are just like other living creatures. We're biologically constructed to be oriented towards self-preservation in the service of survival and reproduction. And so in that way, we're not any different. As Darwin put it, living things like to stay alive. All right, but on the other hand, there's lots of different ways of staying alive, right? We got the turtles with the shells, the giraffes with the long neck. And so that raises the question, well, what about people? And we've got some cool stuff going for us. We're upright and bipedal. We've got the opposable thumb. We've got stereoscopic binocular vision. On the other hand, we would almost all of us be dead by lunchtime if we had to survive simply on the basis of our relatively impoverished physical capabilities. We're just not constructed to survive by ourselves individually. Rather, the reason why we're here is that we're hypersocial at our best, uber cooperative entities that are capable of constructing and maintaining a host of elaborate institutions that facilitate our collective survival. And that's in part, excuse me, because of our vast intelligence. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because I think intelligence is highly overrated unless it's complemented with other moral and ethical sensibilities that seem to be quite lacking these days. All right, but when Becker talks about intelligence, he's like, hey, our degree of abstract symbolic thought is unique in several ways. We are the only creatures, as far as we can tell, capable of conceiving of something that does not yet exist and then having the audacity of transforming our dreams into reality. That's pretty cool. and that in turn, people argue, and I think they're on the right track, that helps us understand why people have been so successful. We are pervasively present in every habitable niche in the world, because if we don't care for the world in the manner in which we encounter it, we have the capacity to alter it in accord with our desires, at least to a degree. And then the other thing that Becker points out, and here he's following the Danish existential philosopher Kierkegaard, he's like, hey, we're so smart that we know that we exist. And I always emphasize this, and I'm very heavy-handed about it, because that's something that Kierkegaard argued that humans take for granted, because that's kind of our default cognitive apparatus. We're not only here, but we know that we're here. And Kierkegaard's point is that it takes a ridiculously sophisticated cognitive apparatus to render yourself the object of your own subjective inquiry. Right, English translation, raccoons are here, but they don't know it. Rose bushes are here, but they don't know it. Let's not get into the argument of whether your dog knows that it's here or not. Let's just agree that we know that we're here. And again, I joke with my students. You get up in the morning and you're like, oh, I woke up. You're like walking to work. And you're like, here I am walking to work. And then you're like, oh, fuck, here I am walking to work, thinking about that I'm walking to work. And now here I am walking to work, thinking about that I'm thinking about. And you can keep going till you get to the nearest tavern where you can circumvent that line of perseverating self-exploration with a few ethanol-infused beverages. But the point is that we are highly self-aware entities. And Kierkegaard said, you know what? That gives us two uniquely human emotions. He called them awe and dread. He's like, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, that is on occasion really awesome. And let's linger on that, because we don't want to just be given half of the message here. It is truly awesome to be alive and to know it. And many of us, if we step back a bit, I hope can acknowledge that some of our finest moments, it's not it that we won a Nobel Prize or you made $1 million. It's just the spontaneous exuberance engendered by the very fact that we exist. You know, you wake up in the morning, get a face full of fresh air on a beautiful day. Maybe you're just walking on the street and you run into somebody, you don't know them, but you just have that little nod. I know that you know that we know that we're here. And I like the James Joyce book. Do you know Ulysses? Yeah, not that any of us have read it. I did after 40 years. But the last sentence of the book is 50 pages, no punctuation. And it starts and ends with the same word, yes. And I love that. It is great to be alive. So let's hold that thought. But then Kierkegaard and Becker turn right around and they're like, yeah, but it's also dreadful. Unless you're a child or an idiot, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you're also smart enough to know that, like all living things, your life is of finite duration and that you too will someday die. All right, so that was the first existential crisis, Becker argues, that was an unanticipated byproduct of our vast intelligence. Right? I'm so smart that I know that when I see somebody in my group being devoured by a hungry lion, that may someday be my fate. Not only will I someday die, but I could also die at any time for reasons that can never be anticipated or controlled. On top of that, Becker adds to just again knee us in the psychological groin. We realize that we're corporal entities. In English, we realize that we're animals, breathing pieces of defecating meat, no more enduring or significant than lizards or potatoes. And for Becker, those three insights, I'm going to die, I can die at any moment, I'm meat with a beat, they would reduce us to psychological rubble. If that's all that we thought about, we wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. We'd be overwhelmed by potentially debilitating existential terror. And Becker's point is that we manage that terror by embracing what he called cultural worldviews, humanly constructed beliefs about reality that we share with other people in our group that minimizes death anxiety by giving us each a sense that life has meaning and we have value. And so these are big ideas for Becker, meaning and value. And so let's do this quickly. He's like, well, what do I mean by meaning? I'm like, hey, I'm an anthropologist. Look at every culture. They all have an explanation of the origin of the universe. They all have prescriptions of how we're supposed to behave while we're here. They all offer possibilities of immortality, either literally, the religions, heavens, afterlives, souls of all of the world's great religions, or symbolically. I may not be here forever, but I'm comforted by the prospect that some vestige of my existence will persist over time. Nonetheless, maybe I'll have children. Maybe I'll amass a great fortune and put my name on a pyramid or an airplane. Maybe I will produce a great work of art or science. And what Becker proposes, and we're almost done with our classic comic book overview, is that whether we're aware of it or not, as human beings, we are fundamentally motivated at all times to preserve our belief in our culturally constructed set of meanings and the value that we derive from them. Because for Becker, it's not enough to live in a meaningful world unless I perceive that I'm a valuable contributor to that world. And every society gives us social roles. If I'm a nurse, I'm supposed to save lives. If I'm a soldier, I'm supposed to kill people. If I'm a banker, I'm supposed to save money, and so on and so forth. And if I meet or exceed the standards associated with the social role that I inhabit. Becker calls that self-esteem. All right. And so basically, that's his take on the motivational underpinnings of human behavior. We are driven by our disinclination to die, to embrace culturally constructed meaning systems that give us a sense that we're persons of value in a world of meaning, and hence eligible for immortality, either literally or symbolically. All right, and then go ahead, Quinn.
I love that. I never have used that. I always say cultural worldviews, cultural worldviews, but a meaning system. I like that a lot.
Me too.
Meaning systems relate better than what cultural worldview. Like, we know what that means, but if you're talking to somebody, a meaning system, I like that.
No, I do too, Quinn. And as I've gotten older, I'm trying to get myself out of my academic habit of spewing the jargon, because when you say to the average person that we are deeply yearning for a sense of meaning in the hopes of perceiving ourselves as having some intrinsic value.
Yes.
Most folks, even when I speak to fifth graders, I see the kids shaking their heads. Yeah, and that's just awesome. And that's one of the things that I've found most compelling about Becker is that most folks, not academics, most people are like, yeah, okay, I get that. All right, yeah. But not everybody, as we were talking about before. There's a lot of people who say, well, look, that's got to be bullshit, if you'll pardon the expression, because I wake up every day and I never think about death.
Yeah.
And our first response to that is to respectfully point out that you are probably comfortably ensconced in a cultural worldview from which you derive a sufficient sense of meaning and value. That is what's keeping death out of consciousness.
It's working. It's working.
All right, but of course, that you're not going to win much in the way of debates.
No.
That's like when Freud would say, am I right or am I right? You either agree with me or you're repressing, in which case I'm right.
Yeah.
But that's where the evidence comes in. And so, this was the early 1980s, so 45 years ago or so. And Tom and Jeff and I, we thought that Becker's ideas were magnificent. We really felt that they were quite compelling, and they helped us understand just a ton of what was going on around us that we didn't think was that explicable otherwise. And so, but we would go around the country and Europe and Canada, and we'd talk about these ideas, and people were quite hostile towards them. And I'd go Shakespeare, methinks thou protest too much. Yeah. I'm going to argue that this is scratching something in the back of your mental landscape. And so what Jeff and Tom and I did as kind of egghead experimental social psychologists was to develop research paradigms that enabled us to test some of these fundamental propositions. And so we did one line of research where we just demonstrated that if you raise people's self-esteem, that indeed does help buffer anxiety. So if self-esteem is momentarily elevated, for example, and people are threatened with electrical shocks, they're not as anxious or physiologically aroused. And so that suggests that self-esteem really is a potent anxiety buffer. All right, but the main question that people had was, how are you dudes going to demonstrate his claim that our meaning systems, our cultural worldviews, are themselves constructed in part to mitigate death anxiety? They're like, that's not even possible. How could you're saying it's unconscious? And this is highly speculative philosophical nonsense. And there's no way that you could ever demonstrate that this is actually happening. And so the main paradigm that we developed to explore these ideas is what we call in psychobabble the mortality salience paradigm. Our thought was, okay, if Becker's right, if people's beliefs, including our own, if our beliefs about reality serve to reduce death anxiety, then let's see what happens when we remind people that they're going to die. Right? Maybe we'll just ask them, hey, what are you thinking? What are your thoughts and feelings about dying? Maybe we'll be more subtle and we'll stop people outside, either in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side. And our thought is if you're standing in front of a funeral parlor, death may be on your mind, even if you don't know it. And then we've got another paradigm where we have people come into the lab and read stuff on a computer. And while they're doing that, we flash the word death for 28 milliseconds. It's so fast that you can't even see anything happening. All right, so now the question is, what happens when we remind people of their own mortality? And what does that help us explain? And so, real quick, so the first thing that Becker wanted to understand is how come we can't get along with other people who don't share our beliefs about reality? And Becker's point is, look, if our beliefs reduce death anxiety, then if somebody believes something different, they're a threat whether you know it or not, because if they're right, you're wrong. And that undermines your confidence in your beliefs and brings concerns about death to the forefront of your mental landscape. Consequently, Becker argued, when we run into people that are different, we denigrate them, we try to get them to dispose of their ideas and accept ours instead. And if that doesn't work, just fucking kill them, thus proving that our beliefs and our God are superior after all. All right, well, sure enough, when we remind Christians they're going to die, they like Christians a lot more and they hate Jewish people. It has nothing to do with Christianity. When Jewish people in Israel are reminded that they're going to die, they love Jewish people more and they hate Christians and Arabs. And it's not just about attitudes. So Germans reminded that they're going to die, they sit closer to people who look German and further away from people who look like Turkish immigrants. Iranians reminded of death are more supportive of suicide bombing, more willing to become one. Americans are more practical. We're not going to kill ourselves, but we're happy to kill other people. When Americans are reminded of death, they are conservative Americans, more supportive of the preemptive use of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons against countries who do not threaten us. So the point is that one thing that we know is that reminders of death increase our hostility to people who are different. We also know that when we remind people that they're going to die, that they become more attracted to fascist populist leaders. Anyone from Hitler to fill in the blank. I'll go with former President Donald Trump. We don't want to make this a political argument, except to note that Hitler came to power at a particularly vulnerable historical moment by claiming that he would make Germany great again. And he was elected without Russian interference. A couple of decades later, we did studies demonstrating that Americans did not care for President George W. Bush after the attacks of September 11th, except if they were reminded of their mortality first, in which case they like Bush a shit ton more. This is because Max Weber, the German sociologist, pointed out that in times of historical upheaval, we tend to be attracted, all of us, to seemingly larger than life individuals who often claim to be divinely ordained to rid the world of evil. Right. And then fast forward to 2016, Donald Trump comes down the elevator. And I was like, that guy's a fascist and that guy is going to win. But this is not about politics. It's about psychology. We did the same studies. Americans didn't like Trump when they were in a benevolent or benign state of mind. It was only when they were reminded of their mortality, then their support for Trump like populist leaders is magnified. Right. Another line of research just demonstrates that we don't like the idea that we're animals, because after all, animals live in nature and animals die. When we remind people that they're going to die, they deny that humans are animals. Their attitudes about animals become more hostile. They become more uncomfortable in nature and more willing to exploit the natural environment for economic gain. And then that brings us to the fact that most people in modernity are addicted to money and stuff, which is also demonstrably a manifestation of existential anxieties. When we remind people they're going to die, they say they need more money to be rich. They say that they want to spend more on luxury items. When we remind people that they're going to die and you just ask them to draw a picture of money, they draw bigger pictures as if money looms larger on their mind. And then the study that freaks me out the most, Tom and some colleagues in Poland did it. They just gave some people money and asked them to count it. They gave other people a stack of pieces of paper and asked them to count it. You didn't get to keep the money. You just had it in your hand for a minute. And then they measured death anxiety. Just counting money reduces death anxiety, suggesting that anyone who thinks that money is just a neutral symbol to exchange goods and services is frighteningly inaccurate in that regard. And finally, one more line of inquiry just has to do with the high levels of psychopathology in the world around us. Why is it that America is a petri dish of psychopathology? A third of Americans are or will be depressed at some point in their lives. Another third are addicted to drugs and alcohol. The other third are driving in their SUVs to Walmart to save a nickel on a chainsaw and a lemon. And anyway, the point that Becker made is look, the fact of the matter is that when people are miserable, it's time to look at the values that we're taught to subscribe to determine whether or not they're realistically attainable by the average individual. And when you look at America, it turns out that right now, a guy named Michael Sandel, philosopher at Harvard, wrote a book called The Tyranny of Merit. And he's like, America's scary right now because we only think you're good if you're the best at what you do. You got to be the richest or you're a loser. You got to be the tallest or you're a loser. If you're a woman, you got to be the youngest or the thinnest, breasts accepted, of course, or you're a loser. If I can't floss my teeth with you, then you're too corpulent, as it were. But anyway, the point that Becker makes is that we live in a world that is accurately describable of one of pervasive psychological dis-ease. Put a hyphen between dis and ease, because we are teaching our kids to subscribe to standards of value that are not realistically attainable by the average individual. And even though that was a little long-winded, I hope that this conveys the two things. One, that Becker is claiming that, know it or not, concerns about death pervade every aspect of our lives. And the other is that people who don't believe that that's the case are, again, with all due respect, either willfully ignorant or intellectually dormant, because there are now several thousand studies, many of them not done by us and our colleagues. And this is important because it's not science until other people are able to replicate these findings. But our view is that we think there's now a pretty large body of evidence in support of his basic claims about the role of death in life.
Yeah, it's amazing, Sheldon. That was awesome. I never, for whatever reason, I never tire of hearing that, and I've been dealing with these things daily for years now. These theories, that was awesome. I'm always fascinated, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm always fascinated when, yes, okay, I'm preoccupied with these ideas. I'm like, I see them everywhere. I hear them everywhere. I mean, it's in everything. And when you realize what these are, and you start, I listen to music, and every song, oh my God, I see artists, I talk to artists, every artist is talking about, they're always scratching the surface. And it drives me crazy that I just want to say, wow, you know what? You're talking about existential dread, existential terror, and terror management here. These, I want to grab people, and say, man, you've got to sit down and think about these deeper, or connect them some way, because I'm most concerned with artists and how creative people, most creative people, let me put it this way, most creative people use these. The act of creating. I wrote a little article called "The Act of Creating Art is Terror Management," meaning that we're making stuff like Becker talks about transference, and Becker, we'll get into that stuff, but we're making stuff. The act of doing that, you're actually managing your existential concerns, your existential dread. And people are like, what do you mean? And people push back on me all the time, right? They're saying the first thing, I don't think about it.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, I don't understand. I don't see how that could possibly be. There's got to be other things. And I always say, yeah, maybe there's some other things, but this is so large. If you just look at the data, read The Worm at the Core, look at the data, read Becker, read Kierkegaard, read these guys that have already tromped through this stuff, and you'll get it. You'll understand it. And my big thing is, how do we take this knowledge? Specifically, I want to know personally how, because I'm incorporating it, and I've incorporated it in my art. Just last Saturday here, we have, last time you came on a year and a half ago or whatever, we do these Saturday shows. And last Saturday, we came on, and I read my artist statement from my first photographic exhibition in 1992 or 1993, one of those two. And it's called Visions in, the preposition in, Visions in Mortality.
Oh, nice.
And all I do is lay out a bunch of stuff about existential dread, existential terror, not knowing who Becker is, not knowing who you guys are, not knowing who Kierkegaard is. I was a 28-year-old punk that's trying to get out of undergraduate school, and I made this work of these existential concerns. So I didn't have anybody around me to encourage me, but I've been making this kind of work for 35 or 40 years and never knowing what it is that I'm doing. And I've voiced that many years, saying, why do people treat people who are different from them so cruelly? What is going on here? And I came close with ideas here, there, and people scratching the surface, but never, ever, until I picked up Becker several years ago and read The Denial of Death. I was like, what? Right. I didn't know he was out there. And this is what I'm trying to encourage artists to do. And what I'd like to know from you, and I think what this audience would be very interested in hearing, is, number one, how does psychology view creativity? And maybe, in a general term, if you know. And number two, how would you talk to creative people in these terms, rather than just the universal, that was beautiful, the universal human condition, we all get it. Do artists differ from the common average person, or as Ronk called them, the artiste manqué, or the failed or unsuccessful artist? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, uh, except they're scattered, but along the lines of what you noted, Quinn. First of all, to me, I, I find it stunning when folks like you say, hey, I was connecting concerns about my transience with my own creative inclinations long before you bumped into Becker or our work. I think to me it's like important. It's maybe a lame metaphor, but I'm like, wait a minute. There's lots of roads that converge on the truth, as it were, and so I think that's important. But also important, and it's one of, I think, the most interesting but also complex parts of the denial of death is when Becker, following Otto Rank, argues and this is based on Rank's book Art and Artist, and he's like, he sees artists at the cutting edge of what is best for humanity in terms of addressing our universal human existential concerns in a way that is both potentially psychologically uplifting as well as conducive to fostering social connections and ultimately social progress. And so the artists now, and the way that Becker puts it, and Ronk does too, is when we think of artists, we're thinking Shakespeare, Mozart, Van Gogh, and so on. But we're all artists. If we just define it in terms of creativity, let's back up because you asked a great question. I like definitions. What do we mean by creativity? Well, let's go back to Becker and Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard said that consciousness engenders the possibility of possibilities. Right. Once we are conscious, that gives us the capacity, as I said earlier, to conjure up in our imagination ideas that do not currently exist. And so, one conception of creativity that we might just say is common sense masquerading as psychological insight, it is just the manifestation of something that wasn't there before. And again, this is not meant to be political, but I always encourage my students to read Karl Marx. He's a crappy economist, but he was a great psychologist. And in his economic and philosophical manuscripts, written in 1844, he said, once you're conscious, we can't help it that consciousness engenders in each of us, whether we're aware of it or not, just the urge to express ourselves somehow. And again, it could be Van Gogh, or it could be me, like drawing things on my sneakers. Could be somebody in their garden figuring out a new way to tweak a tomato plant. I've never seen an individual who, under optimal circumstances, is disinclined to express themselves in a way that is a reflection of who they are as an indivial. And
it's so true. It's so
it is so true.
I think about those handprints in the French caves
exactly
years ago.
No, exactly. And so Ronk and Becker, they're trying to get us all ultimately to conceive of ourselves as artists, but just to help us understand the process. They're like, well, What is it that an artist is doing? And again, we need not be aware of this fact for it to be true, with all due respect to even artists who disavow that this might be happening. But according to Becker, following Ronk, artists have both the inclination and the capacity to transform their existential anxieties into some kind of tangible manifestation. The philosopher Suzanne Langer called art the objectification of subjective experience. It's not just like a baby having an emotional outburst. It's the sublime capacity to refine our existential concerns in a way that ultimately converts them into a tangible product of some sort, be it a poem, a plant, a play, a painting, and so on and so forth. And what Becker and Ronk argue is that when an artist is able to do that successfully, they have produced their own sense of meaning and value.
Yes.
And that in an ideal universe, that sense is not confined to them as individual artists, but rather is radiated throughout the community, not just to get rich and famous. That's okay. Most artists that I know that are not narcissistic sociopaths have a genuine concern for the possibility that their art will have some kind of consequential and inspirational effect on the people who partake of it. That's why I like Suzanne Langer, who talks in those terms. And so that's kind of like the good news. And so Becker and Ronk, they were like, well, other people, not everybody responds to existential anxieties in an artistic fashion.
Right.
So they're like, okay, what's the average person do? Well, in the denial of death, Becker's pretty harsh. He's like, the average person is a culturally constructed meat puppet. And then he uses Kierkegaard's phrase, who is tranquilized by the trivial, right? They are more concerned that there won't be enough chicken wings on Super Bowl Sunday as they spray Cheese Whiz on a cracker and down their 12th crappy beer than the fact that the planet's melting and that democracy is degenerating. And Becker's point is these folks are dangerous, that these are the people who are most disinclined to accept somebody else who doesn't share their beliefs. And so that's one possibility, is just the average individual. And then there's the neurotic individual. And here Becker has an interesting take, because you already mentioned this, that Becker refers, following Ronk, to the neurotic individual as an artist. Is it a manique, kind of a fake?
Artiste manqué, yeah.
Yeah, you got the word.
An unsuccessful or failed artist.
Yeah, and that's a half of a compliment, because this is like following Freud. So basically, Freud said, okay, what's the difference between the neurotic individual and the so-called normal individual? And Freud's like, well, all right, the normal individual doesn't even have the imagination to construct their own idiosyncratic defenses. In other words, and he's not being cynical, but he's like, okay, if you're a Christian and you make the sign of the cross when you're in an anxiety-provoking situation, well, fine. But his point is, there may be other individuals that have their own neurotic affectations. And so rather than make the sign of the cross when I'm anxious, I may go to my desk like I am now, and I line up my pen and my pencils. Like I can't start writing unless my pen and my pencils are all parallel, even though I haven't been writing by hand for 40 years. All right. And Becker's point is like, well, you might want to mock the neurotic person, but at least they have the imagination to conjure up their own neurotic affectations. They are not relying on shared neurotic symptoms. All right. But, and here's the important point, he's like, yeah, the neurotic individual wants to express themselves as an individual, and let's not denigrate that the righteous desire. On the other hand, they tend to lack at least two important dimensions that artists have, and that's motivation and discipline, leading ultimately to artistic skill. So I tell stories about people that I've worked with. Have a friend 30 years ago. He came into our house one day and he's like, "Hey, I just bought a saxophone, and I'll be like John Coltrane in a week or two." And I'm like, "No, you won't. Fuck not." John Coltrane used to hide in closets for 12 hours practicing like one little snippet. And you're telling me, without ever having had a music lesson, that you expect to be playing in large stadiums in the not too distant future? And my best example for the students that I work with at Skidmore, I'm like, let's go to Amsterdam and Holland and go to the Van Gogh Museum. I don't know if you've ever been there or seen it, but I love how it's organized, where you see him early on drawing an apple.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute, this guy didn't do Starry Nights a few days after he started. And the of course, talent is useful, but it turns out that most folks who excel in either art or science have thousands of hours of devoted effort that's not always particularly pleasant.
Yeah.
And so, what distinguishes the artist is the inclination to express themselves creatively, juxtaposed with the motivation that ultimately affords them the discipline to eventually acquire the set of skills that puts them in a position to express themselves artistically.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, but to keep going just a little bit, Quinn, because
Yeah.
that would and so that sounds pretty good for the artist, and yet we know that artists can be quite successful as artists, but psychodynamically distressed.
Yes.
And,
That's where I was going. Sheldon, we just had this conversation.
right?
I've been throwing up quotes. I threw up one from Virginia Woolf. I threw up one from Sylvia Plath. I threw up
Yep.
one from J.D. Salinger. And I got some pushback. Like, why are you showing, Plath, died by suicide.
Yep.
Woolf did. Mental institutions, tortured, right?
Yes.
Where is their buffer? They created all this great art. Where is their buffer?
Yeah. Well, I think there's the counterpoint, and that is that, as a metaphor, I would say that artists, I think you put it this way, Quinn, in your email, and I love the way that you expressed it, that on the one hand, there is an openness to experience that I would submit is common to all great artists.
Agree, 100%.
And it doesn't follow from that we're able to equally manage the psychodynamic consequences of seeing things without tinted glasses.
Right, right.
Uh,
And so,
uh,
would you say this is an accurate statement if I said something to this effect? Um, okay, Sylvia Plath was tortured, manic depressive, whatever, all that stuff. Virginia Woolf as well too, right?
yeah,
I think one of them was abused as a child, all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, all kinds of baggage to deal with.
yes,
So would this be a fair statement to say, for me, I am fully consciously aware when I make art and if I'm making a photograph or I do a painting here, so, and I feel good, it actually buffer. I can actually feel the psychological impact of
yeah,
creating something. And like, Becker said at the end of his book, he ascribed to that. He said, fashion something, throw it, kind of into that, right? That whole
yes,
thing. And so would it be a fair statement to say I get maximum mileage out of my meaning system, and maybe Sylvia Plath and Virginia Woolf and J.D. Salinger or whomever, right? Maybe they did great work, but maybe they didn't get the full impact of the buffering system.
yeah, fair enough. Although those of us that are lucky enough to have partaken of their work, we have benefited.
Yes,
Yes,
absolutely. And we
yeah,
benefited from their insight, their seeing reality. I love the Becker's thing about the refusal of reality, not seeing reality as it is.
yeah,
That's what I love about artists mostly. And that's what I try to do is I try to arouse or encourage this idea of let's really look at what reality is and talk about this. And I talked about my meaning system and the cultural worldviews that kind of let Becker and on Ronk kind of say they don't ascribe, there's no constructs that they can lean on to get the satisfaction. So they have to kind of forage their own through art. And that's what I feel like I do a lot. I feel like I'm not into football games. I would be the most boring guy if you were the average person around. Like, you don't know who the Miami Penguins are. You don't know what I don't know any of that. I don't know. So I've constructed my own through creativity. I've constructed my own little, something to lean on to give myself some buffering from my existential dread. But at the same time, I'm conscious somewhat of benefiting from that, creating artwork and putting it out in the world. Now I'm taking these theories and trying to make personal work around these ideas and put it out into the world with these theories and terror management and everything kind of grouped in for the artist to see what they're doing. That's my biggest goal is I have it in my head and I can't get it out.
Well, to be silly, I respectfully disagree. You are getting it out, but this is very hard because we have no choice as humans. We're using words to describe what are non-linguistic affectations.
Yeah.
And so no, I don't see any other alternative or any other viable alternative than folks like you who are basically on a cutting edge of sorts, because you're a practicing artist familiar with this discourse that you're finding compatible with your own subjective experience as a human and as an artist.
Yes.
And again, there's no doubt, there's ample evidence that creative artistic expression serves to mitigate existential anxieties in many, but not all individuals.
Okay.
And
fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, and we know that like bipolar disorder and the major depression is often associated with lots of tremendous artists, and as you put it, Yeah, they have produced great work for humanity without benefiting from their efforts as a result. And this is something that might be, and now I'm just saying stuff randomly, but as I'm talking, I'm like, wow, that would be something maybe worth studying. Is there a way of helping those kinds of artists
Yes.
um, become more psychologically in a state of well-being by appreciating what they've done? Because we do know, Quinn, that that the act of creativity is most effective in terms of reducing existential anxieties when the artist perceives that their work has a social dimension.
Ah,
And
yeah.
to me, this is what's important.
Okay.
It's not. And again, I say this to the art students here at Skidmore. They're like, "I'm just painting for me." I'm like, "No, you're not, because otherwise, why would you be showing the work to me? Why is it that you're beaming when somebody at the art exhibit who doesn't know that you did a painting is like glowing as they are clearly engaged with their intersection? And,
Yeah.
and my thing is, it is not, that's not arrogance or narcissism
Right.
so much as what I think is one of the most rewarding feelings imaginable. We call it a sense of cosmic connectivity these
Yeah.
days. It's just that, wait a minute. And Joseph Conrad, the
Art of Darkness.
yeah. And, pardon the expression, but it's his book title, The Nigger of Narcissus. In the forward of that book, that he writes about that being the ultimate function of art, is that it connects us with each other, those of us that are alive, while at the same time connecting us to those who came before us, and making connections to those who come thereafter. And when I read that, I was
That's
like,
beautiful. That's beautiful.
beautiful. Right, beautiful by a beautiful artist, telling us what it is that art does, that at its best, for both the artist and the people who partake of art. And I
Yeah.
find that
Yeah. That's
magnificent.
powerful. And Sheldon, in this group, mostly the people who watch this, the 3 or 4 people that watch this, which are very important to me, by the way.
Yeah.
No, there are a few more that watch it, but most of them, not all of them, but most of them are not interested. I have to make a clear, definitive line between personal fine art and commercial art,
Yeah.
making money off of art and making art because you have this preoccupation with this idea and you just have to get it out.
That's right.
Could you talk a little bit about transference, Becker's idea of transference, and Ronk's idea of it, I guess, is really what it is, right? I mean, transferring the artist, transferring their anxiety onto the work and putting it out there. And then I read Becker talking about Ronk, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the other downside, as Ronk puts it, to artists and creative mind or creative type is that while they make work, what they're doing usually are going. So we want to be in good graces in our culture. We want to do the things that our culture says to do and bolster our self-esteem and feel good. I got a job raise. I followed the speed limit. All these things that make us feel good in our culture and meaning and significance and all that. But Ron talked about, and correct me if I'm wrong, he said, look, the downside with artists, it can be great to have this happen and to put it out, and they're wonderful, and they got this openness and this imaginative thing, anything's possible. But sometimes they'll create work that goes against their culture,
Good.
and they're going to get a backlash from that. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. So good point. By definition, creativity is a departure from the status quo, right? If you were
Yes.
happy with the way things are, there'd be no impetus to render it otherwise.
Yes.
And yeah, this is puts the artist in an interesting bind, says
Yes.
Ronk and Becker, because how do you know if you're great, right? So basically, you're an artist. You did something, and you think it's great. All right, and then all of the people think it's great. But wait a minute, there, who knows if it's great? Because these are the people who are devoted to the status quo. And so now Becker's like, and this is Ronk, he's like, hey, wait a minute. This causes what they called existential guilt,
Yes.
hubris.
That's it. That's it. Yeah.
And that's it. And it's like, well, so this is a problem, because how do I know if I'm good? If I say I'm good because the public thinks I'm good, that means nothing, because that's the status quo. If I say I'm good because I'm good, well, now I'm playing God.
Yeah.
And how do I know if there's any merit to those claims?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a great explanation. When I read that, I was like, wow, that is a dilemma. This is what do you do, right? I mean, now we got two problems. We got the problem of death.
There you go.
The problem of the artist getting involved in this.
Absolutely.
Punching against culture. Yeah.
Yeah. And Ronk's remedy, as I understand it, is this idea of social connection. So we've done studies where we've shown that when people do something creative, they actually feel more guilty otherwise, except if we have a manipulation where their creative activity has some kind of social connection. So here I think.
So what you're saying, Sheldon, you're saying because creativity is out of the norm.
Yes.
When we do it solo, we feel guilty about, ooh, we're doing something like, ooh, my culture won't like this, is kind of naughty or nasty or something.
Yeah.
But then if we do it with a social connection and the people get in on it, hey, all good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And like anything, it's kind of an oscillating, there's a sweet spot. Because again, yet that creativity, like it or not, we're going out on a proverbial limb.
Yeah, that's what people don't understand here, I think. And if you look at it from the psychological underpinnings, if you will, if you look at it from that perspective, creativity is a deviation from, the psychological norm of your culture. Yeah, exactly.
That's
yeah.
correct.
It's fascinating to me. That is fascinating. What about Becker's idea of transference?
Well, so he takes Freud described transference in the context of therapeutic relationships.
Yes.
And Freud argued that when the patients got connected to the therapist, that, most other therapists is like, that's terrible. We got to do something to get rid of that. And Freud was like, well, first of all, that's not going to happen. So why don't we investigate the nature of that connection? Basically, when we're talking about transference, you are transferring your psychodynamic relationships to significant others to the people that you're now presently engaged with. And what Becker did was to say, look, transference doesn't just happen in therapy, it happens in life. Every one of us, again, whether we're aware of it or not, transfer some sense of power and authority to something outside of ourselves. And so for some people, it's God. For some people, it's a political leader. For some people, it's tofu or yoga. And what and so what Becker ultimately concludes is that we should not see transference as necessarily a sign of weakness so much as a universal aspect of human existence, which then shifts the question to have we yoked ourselves to something that is ultimately expands us as individuals rather than constrains us. And, again, so for example, there's some people whose lives revolve around the New York Yankees, let's say,
Right.
their favorite sports team.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe that makes them feel pretty good moment to moment, but that is a rather narrow conception of reality upon which to base your entire sense of self, and so, yeah, I'm not sure where I'm heading with this.
Well, we're just saying, we're talking about how transference, and that's a great explanation of that phenomenon, or that whatever you want to call it. The transference that Becker talks about through Ronk about, and Becker making the point that we're doing this with all kinds of stuff. How does it work in art? How do artists? What is that idea of, let me get my anxiety out onto this piece of paper or this image or this painting? What is that? Is this all outside of consciousness as well?
Well, it can't be, because you're talking about it. No, I find this. My sister is an artist, and she speaks in those terms. She doesn't know any of the work that I do,
Okay.
and yet I find it interesting to hear her say that I'm letting my pen or whatever I'm using, that's my etch a sketch. That's a reflection of my current psychodynamic concerns. I am transferring. She doesn't use those words, but why not think in those terms?
I definitely do, and I can actually feel it. I mean, at least psychologically, I can feel it. I mean, it's I need to do this. I don't like. It's almost like I don't have a choice. I'm like compelled to do it. It's like it's almost like a cup of coffee in the morning kind of thing. It's like I got to do this kind of thing. But I'm always fascinated with this idea that what Becker, when he talks about at the end of his book, The Denial of Death. You go through that book. If you've never read it, guys, you should read it, and definitely read The Worm at the Core. I read your book last year, all 11 chapters on this YouTube channel, every word of it. But if you haven't read The Denial of Death, you should read it, because you go through that book and you're expecting this great, big, momentous, here's the answer at the end, and you never get it. You don't really get Becker. What is your take on Becker's solution? Does he have one? Does he mention a solution for these? Is there a problem to the knowledge of our death? Is there a solution to that?
Yeah, well, let me know, because then we'd be chugging rum out of a coconut on the beach with our Nobel Prizes. No,
right.
Awesome. First of all, let me second what you just said, Quinn. So, I've been a professor for 45 years, and I say the same thing when I get to talk about our work that I did 45 years ago, which is that if there's anything that we've done that's useful in our gathering today, it would be to encourage people to partake of Becker's work directly. I find what he says and how he says it to be quite compelling. Even though, again, for young folks that may be listening to us, the book was written in the 1970s. We are all victims as well as beneficiaries of the time in which we live and write. He does say some things that we be considered wrong or stupid today. And when you see that, if it's your book, not from the library, just tear that page out And when you're done, there'll still be so many pages of amazing stuff
Yeah, yeah,
that you just yeah. So that's a big point for me.
yeah. His take on homosexuality, some of the mental health issues,
Good.
the pronouns. Of course, I always have to, when I'm reading Becker, I always have to, hey,
Me
this
too.
is 1968, this is 60s to the 70s kind of thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Like you said, I got a little bit into Martin Heidegger too. I'm not really into Nazis that
No,
much.
me neither. So that's good. That's a story for another time. We should get together and talk about Heidegger, because I avoided him for 40 years because he was a Nazi. But
Becker did too, eh?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that the work is quite exciting and inspirational, and that's right. I think that what would be very useful at this time is to just encourage folks to take advantage of these ideas.
I'm coming to that point too, and we greatly appreciate your time, Sheldon. You're amazing. Your whole crew. I mean, Jeff and Tom. I haven't met Tom, but Jeff's amazing, and you're wonderful. I thank you so much for coming back on here. I know people will get something out of this. If nothing else, that message.
Yeah.
Come on, look at Becker. Read The Worm. Read The Birth of Death of Meaning, Denial of Death, and Escape from Evil. Those are all really, if you're an existentialist or lean toward those kinds of things, these guys are it. They got you handled there. We greatly appreciate your time. Jeffrey, did you have any questions, brother?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I can't thank enough with all you've said, both of you, Quinn and Sheldon, because I remember when Quinn used to do these Saturday shows, it was more about the process of what we like with the wet plate stuff, and then we started doing critiquing. And I remember one of the works that I'd submitted was of, because I like photographing landscape, and there's one place I used to go to would photograph the salmon run.
Yes, I remember.
And that's when it all started for me, with the fact that because the salmon would swim upstream, despite
yes,
wolves, coyotes, bears, especially, easy picking for those animals, right? And I remember thinking about it, as humans, we'd always avoid that. Anything that we know, but obviously now I've come to understand, like most animals don't really understand that part.
Yes.
At least that's what we think. I don't know.
Yeah, I remember those, Jeffrey. Those are good. Yeah.
So it just always come to me now, like thinking, like when we do this, when I create my work, I was kind of thinking back of like, why we're doing the things that we do.
Yes.
How we react to things.
And I tell people this, and Sheldon, you know this is you far better than any of us here. Everything you run into, once these things are in your head, and once you've really deeply thought, and I know Jeffrey understands them. This is one person that I know he understands these theories. Once you get them in your head, you see them everywhere. I mean, Jeffrey, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but a couple of weeks ago, Jeffrey came on the show and he said, I just spent 2 days in conference. He works in a university in Canada, in Vancouver. And he says, I just came from a seminar, 2 days of seminar for DEI or even, what's the other one? Justice. And you know what Jeffrey did, Sheldon? They were talking about all this bigotry and racism and this and that. Jeffrey brought up terror management theory. Yes, that is awesome. I love it. I feel like we're kind of evangelizing these ideas, but you know what? At the same time, I think I'm with everybody. I think the world needs them. We're in really tough shape. I worry about at least this country pretty much every day. I mean, I really do. It's. Chopper had a question here, Sheldon. He said, an artist with a genuine new or different expression of art is then creating or adding a new aspect of culture. If their new culture is accepted, then they would be considered successful.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful question.
Yeah.
And
thanks, Chopper.
Yeah, I do. So thank you for that. Back earlier, Quinn, when we agreed that the idea of meaning is like so central, and the fact of the matter is that art are tangible reflections of meaning.
Yes.
And I like thinking about meaning as like a culturally constructed tapestry that we all benefit from, and that at our best, we all get to add a stitch or two.
There you go. There you go. I love that. That's beautiful.
And I like that. And I do. I think that we're all in a position by virtue of our creativity to add some stitches into the delicate fabric of meaning upon which we all depend on in order to stand up in the morning. And the other thing that I would point out is that it's just simply not for us to judge whether or not we've been successful there. We read, Henry David Thoreau's Walden. It sold like 75 copies. Van Gogh sold, he's almost dead, and he's saying to his brother, I think I'm getting pretty good. So let's not measure success by immediate effects. Let's have the courage and humility to create without the need to be materially affirmed at the present moment.
I love it. Yeah. I ascribe to that 1,000%, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I just do. And we're living in this world now where I love how you said in your intro there about, man, you can't be second or third or fourth or fifth. Right. You've got to be right there, or it's meaningless, right?
Yeah.
We live in that world now, and man, every human being can share something that will impart a little bit of something for us as an artist, right? I mean, the artist creating it. I mean, that's powerful. Can I leave you with two things, Sheldon?
Go.
First, I want to ask you a question. Yes, kind of a yes or no, maybe, if you can. Let's see if you can do this. So with all of this said, we're born, like Becker said, we're born in this place and all these things we have no control over. We're thrown into this world that we have no clue about it. And humanity has created all these constructs for us to lean on, to go to our job and spend money and drive this car and do all this. And then great folks like you come along, and Jeff and Tom, and create these wonderful theories with empirical evidence and explaining all these kind of behaviors and why we're treating each other so poorly and all these world wars and all this kind of stuff going on. But at the end of the day, is it true to say this is all absolute, and please, I'm not a pessimist or a nihilist or a nihilist, but this is all meaningless? And at the end of the day, we'll all be forgotten and won't really matter much, but it matters a lot to us now. Isn't it the truth that this is just all, I mean, everything that I've done, everything that anybody's ever done, it will go away, right? I mean, that's kind of a pessimistic nihilist kind of view, right? But it's true, though. When you think about the long run, it's true. But it doesn't get you out of bed in the morning, though, does it?
Yeah, no, there you go. Again, in the long run, the sun's going to burn out.
Yeah.
Things are going to get bad. In the short run, though.
Yeah, the short run.
I'm a fan of the Otto Rank dude. What did he say? He said consciousness is the temporal representative of the cosmic primal force.
Okay, yeah.
And that's in his book, Truth and Reality. And when I first read it, I was like, dude, this is before hallucinogens. What are you talking about? And his point, though, is subtle and profound. He's like, look, we are all directly descended from the first form of life,
yes,
right? Of necessity.
Yeah.
We're therefore directly related to everything that's ever been alive. It may be indirectly, but it's directly related to everything that is. We're related to everything that's ever been alive, to everything that is alive,
yes,
to everything that ever will be alive. And even if in the long run, the entire billions of years of life, whatever that means, even if there's a beginning and an end to that, it is still the case that what we do or don't do while we're here may have dramatic downstream consequences that impact the future of humanity for millions of years, even if we're ultimately extinguished when the sun goes out.
Good point.
Yeah, and I just find that important and uplifting. Yeah. It's like, yeah. All right, you just don't know. Henry Miller, a dead novelist from the last century, he's like, you don't really know. You're like, oh, I've fucking never done anything. Yeah, but you don't remember that you were walking the other day and you were walking on a bridge and somebody was about to jump off it, except that you gave them a little nod, momentarily restoring that person's connection to humanity. And instead of jumping off the bridge, they end up being the next Gandhi or Martin Luther King. And so you're long dead, but unbeknownst to yourself, your lapse into humanity has literally altered the course of human history.
Wonderful point. I love it.
And I just find that, and so, yeah, back to Chopper.
Yeah, Chopper followed up.
Yeah, I love that. That's true. Maybe 3 generations at best. Yeah, but I still, and I agree with that. And I still, from time to time, find myself going back before then and wondering who my folks were of yesteryear. Similarly, I have a granddaughter now, and I'm 70 years old. She's 2 years old.
Nice.
There's something amazing about realizing that if all goes well, she's going to live most of her life after I've been summarily obliterated. I don't find that distressing at this point. I find that our interactions at the moment, I'm optimistic, may have some consequence by virtue of what we keep calling in our little lab, just a sense of cosmic connection.
Yes. And I find it curious that I see myself, and I totally agree with, Becker and Ronk and all the great thinkers and writers that have talked about how wonderful the human mind is. And we are incredible creatures. I mean, we just are, right? We really are. And that's why I'm not a pessimistic philosopher, nihilist or nihilist. I'm not any of that. I'm so grateful to be above the ground today. I'm so grateful to have the things I have and all those things.
That's right.
But at the end of the day, I find myself with all that big old frontal lobe sticking out there and making me think all these crazy ideas. I still find myself thinking, wow, look at my cat. My cat's just here, and I'm going to be more like my cat.
Yes.
I'm just going to be right here, right now, and just, wow, those Friskies are really good. They taste great, and that's all I care about right now, and not worried about all those things. So they're, that upside downside. But you're right. I read that paper called A Quiet Ego.
Oh, I love that paper.
Yeah, I think she's a professor in Michigan or somewhere. I can't remember.
Yeah, well, she's Tom's student, so she's one of our people. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. No, what? Yeah, okay. Well, there you go then. I love that. And so now, like you, I've been following you for a long time, obviously, but now, like you, I'm looking at this, gratitude, humility, and awe thing.
Yeah.
And Heidegger's quote and all these wonderful, this kind of flip side to all of this stuff, right? Living in the moment, being grateful that you woke up this morning and all those things, rather than talking about being curled up and in terror and dread. People, that's what turns a lot of people off. Is this kind of, oh, you're such a downer. And it's like, wait, hold on. No, it's not all. Hold on. This can be really beneficial. And that's what I'm trying to tell people is I hope in the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see the actual manifestation of what I've been going through for about 6 or 7 years now. I hope to do this work creatively with the interjection of your ideas and Becker's and Kierkegaard's and all these people, and present it as an artist, a working artist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a nothing, right? I'm a creative person that's fascinated with being alive and wondering why people treat people so differently sometimes, and having the answers to that, and then kind of rolling that out in a big, comprehensive, creative piece. We'll see if that happens. I don't know. But one more thing, I'll let you go. I wanted to share one thing. I made a painting the other day right here, which I'm kind of proud of. And I made it. It's called Swallowing My Illusion. Okay. Nice. So it as a creative person, we're using symbols, and we're symbolic and we're biological. This is my symbolic portion. I want to show you this. I want to see. I know you're a scientist, but you still have some artsy. You still totally look like that guy on the cover of Aqualung, Jethro Tull. I mean,
that's right.
Somebody asked me, said, "Hey, is that dude?" I said, "No, no," but he does like that album.
That's
okay,
right.
Here it is.
Oh, nice.
so what we've got, Swallowing My Illusion. And
wow.
So fish have always been this great kind of, ancestral spiritual world kind of thing. And then this body, this kind of primitive human, Homo sapien, So I'll leave you with this. One of my big desires, hopefully in the next couple of 2 or 3 years, is try to encourage artists to come over to the Becker TMT side and think more about creating work with these ideas. What do you think, Sheldon?
Absolutely. But it cuts both ways. I'd like to see a more of the eggheads in a dynamic engagement with the artistic folks. And
nice.
And I say that because one of the things that I believe is important is, for us not to become fixated on Becker's ideas or terror management theory, for that matter.
Sorry.
I'm like, let's get fixated on parlaying those ideas into future action. That's what it's like. That excites me.
I hear that.
Yeah, I'm like I say to my students, if you're having trouble sleeping, I'll show you some of our experiments. It's a non-pharmacological intervention for insomnia.
Yeah.
But if we want to jump into the 21st century together, let's do more like this. Remember, Otto Ronk's last book was Beyond Psychology.
I have not read that, no.
It's worth a look, because here's one of my favorite psychologists in his late 50s or so saying, I've spent my entire life studying living. Now let me live some living. and so this is quite remarkable and important to hear from people that, again, I'm not denigrating what I do. I think the ideas are important.
Absolutely.
In the long run, though, it's what happens to them and with them. And my hope is that this is the beginning of a dynamic engagement, not only between us, but between us and the folks that we're hoping might be affected by this. And by the way, I don't care if 4 people or less listen to this, because if a single person is inspired to be other than they were because of anything that's happened in this session, awesome.
Absolutely. So well said. I think I know the answer to this question. It's a little off par, but Ben Crone says, hi from Ballston Spa. Did Sheldon really invent the doughboy?
Yes, I did.
A lot, Sheldon.
Yeah, so thank you, Ben. I did when I was in college. I was in an inebriated stupor, and that's what was in the refrigerator. But tell Ben to come by and see me.
Okay, yeah, very good. Go check. Awesome. Go have a doughboy there in Saratoga Springs. Yeah, awesome. Excellent. Sheldon, you are a wonderful human being. We are so grateful that you're alive and that you've done the work you've done, and we are beyond thankful for you coming in and spending this entire hour and a half with us. And I hope, man, I know you're a busy dude. You probably want to be hanging this stuff up pretty soon and go live some living, and I get that. But man, if we ever get another chance to get on board again and see where we're at, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, you know how to find me. So let's see this as an ongoing exchange.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir. Jeffrey, thank you so much. And everybody that came in to see us, thank you. Have a great evening. And we'll see you Saturday for my regular thing. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.
Awesome.